Now we're going to take a look at all of the different settings that we have available within the Advanced Material Editor for editing our materials. So I'm going to start out just by adding in a standard terrain. Just frame that in our view a little. I'm going to double click on our preview of our material to bring up the Advanced Material Editor. And I currently have our default surface assigned, which is a simple material. And I'm going to change our mapping mode to Object Standard instead of Parametric. And we can take a look and see all of the different tabs that we have available for editing our material. We have our Color and Alpha tab, our Bumps tab, Highlights, Transparency, Reflections, Translucency, and Effects. And we are going to go through all of these settings and all of these options for each of the tabs and sort of work through the materials to figure out exactly what it is we can do with them. But before we go ahead and make any changes, let's take a look to the upper left of our material editor, and we can see we have a name. This allows us to give a custom name to this material, which is stored when we save our material. So I'm just going to call this name terrain_custom. And now we have a specific material name that will be used if we decide to save out this material. You also notice that in our layer, we have this material show up and updated as our terrain custom. And it's just a much easier way of sorting through all of your different layers if you're working with multiple layers. And we'll take a look at that once we go through all of our major functions. And then we're going to start combining multiple layers and then also taking a look at our mixed materials and our volumetric materials. To start out, we're going to take a look at our Color and Alpha tab. Now we can see we have a coloring mode, we have color correction, and then we also have our color production. Now by default, this is set to Procedural Colors, which means we're using a procedural node in order to calculate exactly what our color is going to look like. And we'll actually go into the function editor and take a look at how that's done. But first, let's click on Mapped Picture. And this gives us the ability to define our color based on an image map. We can see right here that we have our picture file settings, and right now it's currently set to black because nothing is loaded. If we click on our little arrow, we can open up our chooser in which pictures we'd like to load in. If you have anything else loaded in or any other images you would like to add to this library, then you're going to want to go down to the bottom and select a new collection and then load that in. And it's always a good idea to have everything loaded into view before you actually start working in the function editor because that'll prevent a lot of crashes from happening. Because if you're just loading in files directly and don't actually have a library created for them, it can sometimes cause errors. So let's take a look at some of our default surfaces we have in here. And if we select our tile, you can see this is 480 by 480 pixels, and I'm going to click OK. And now this is our image that we're using to create and customize our color for our material. If we take a look in our preview, we can see this tile showing up on our surface. And we can see our tile outlines overall on our terrain. Now, because we're working with texture rather than a procedural color, we also have independent mapping modes. These mapping modes are covered in the Mapping chapter, which goes through all of these different settings and how they affect different objects. In this case, we have it set to automatic, which is basically going to set us to flat vertical because we're working with the terrain. Or we can see the Faces mode is also a possibility. So we can go through our different options and see really what's the best and what's going to look the best. And like I said, that chapter on mapping will cover that entirely and the most important settings. But in this case, we want to use automatic, which will work the best for our terrain because we want to be mapping directly down. Either automatic or flat vertical will work quite well for this. Change this to flat vertical, and we can see that show up, and it basically looks exactly the same. And that's because what we're doing is just covering our entire terrain with the specific image map. And we are projecting from the top, and we really don't need to worry about any of the sides. If you have a material or a terrain where you're going to have very steep slopes, then you might want to change this to faces, and that could end up giving you a much better look. And what we can do is adjust our image scale, and I'm going to bring this down to 0.5. And now if we take a look at our preview render, we can see our tiles are much closer together, and we have a lot more of them. If we want to see even more tiles, and even more of this material showing up on our terrain, then we can decrease the scale. And the scale right now, we have 0.5 on both the X and the Y. But if you wanted to, you could easily change these. I could do the Y as a 1, and then we'll notice a bit of stretching. And if we take a look, we can see these squares where we have the Y-axis, which is traveling from the lower part of our screen more to the upper part, a little bit to the right because of the way our camera is positioned, but we have a lot of stretching in our material in that direction, and that's based on our image scale. I'm going to bring that down to 0.5 again, so we're working with something that's symmetrical, and we can also see that update in our scene where our terrain show up and our material shows up correctly. Underneath our image scale, we have an image offset. This allows us to adjust on the X and the Y, as we did with the image scale, our exact origin. So in other words, where our material starts. And the best way to really see that is to look at the edge of our material and our terrain, and I'm just going to move our camera into position so we can get a much closer look at the side of this terrain. And we can see right now where our line is coming from the edge of our tile, and we can see that's along, and there's a little bit of an offset of the edge of our terrain. And we can see that in the preview as well, and they are matching. But if we wanted to move this surface so that we had our seams or our connections between our two different tiles, we can adjust the offset, which will move our material into position without actually changing its scale, just exactly where it's being created. So if we change our offset to 0.2 on the X, we can take a look and we can see a little bit of a movement. Let's do negative 0.2. And we can see that basically looks the same. And it really depends on the overall scale of your actual object and the scale of the material itself. Let's bring this up to 0.5. And we're actually going to need to use some larger values in order to see this. But let's take a look, once again, just where the placement is of our seams. And let's adjust our offset. Let's go ahead and bring this up to 700. And now we're going to notice some display errors in the actual OpenGL scene preview. But if we take a look at the actual render, we can see that everything does look correct. We just have this image offset, and now our line is in an entirely different place. So we can do that on the Y as well. We'll do 800 on the Y. We could have that update, and now we can see this texture is moving more along. And one thing to keep in mind is that our image offset is based on pixels, and that the units are set up a little bit differently. So we're adjusting our image offset based on 700 pixels on the X, and on the Y, moving it by 800 pixels. And these are positive directions because we do not have any negative signs in front of them. So if we take a look at our tile, we can see that 480 by 480 is our total pixel dimension. So if I was to change this to 480 by 480, and we take a look, and we let that preview render, we can see the position is exactly the same as it was before, because we're creating the exact same offset as the actual image itself. And because we're doing that, we end up in the exact same place we were before. So higher numbers are definitely needed, although you can still do fractional numbers and decimal numbers to be a lot more precise about your total image position. So we could set these values to 200, and take a look at our preview. And now we can see that reflected in our preview, where our lines have now disappeared off of the sides, and we can correctly position our image offset. Now if we take a look underneath our image offset, we have an interpolation type. This is something very important if you're working with lower pixel resolution images and you're zooming very close to an object. If we have this set to none, we are going to be seeing the exact texture. And if I zoom in closer to our actual material and our terrain, and we just want to get fairly close up, and we're just going to take a look at our preview for that. And we're also going to go to our render options, make sure it's set to final, render to screen, and I'm going to do an 800 by 600 render. And if we take a look, we can see all of the pixels from our texture map. And that's because the size isn't large enough for us to be this close to that texture. So if I close this out, and we take a look at our interpolation types, we have 3 different settings other than none being on. And if you're working with much higher resolutions where you're not going to see the pixels at all, then you just want to keep it on none. But in this case, where we're zoomed in very close, we're going to need to use one of these other 3 settings, either bilinear, normalized, or bicubic. And each one of these settings will blend together our pixels in a way where it won't appear pixelated. But each has different settings and different ways of calculating. So let's take a look at the bilinear mode. We'll just go ahead and render that. With bilinear, we can see that we no longer see the pixels, but we do have a lot of blurring and smoothing because of the way our pixels are blending into each other. But of course, if we are typically going to be zoomed in this close to a texture, we're going to want something a little bit higher. But in the case where you're sort of going in and out and you have an overall scene, this might work for you, where you're able to just sort of blend your pixels together and you don't need to worry about seeing them all show up as individual pixels. We also have a normalized mode, and let's go ahead and render that. And with the normalized, we see more of the pixel definition, and we're actually working with values proportional to the distance of our corners of our pixels and blending that way, rather than the entire pixel just blending together. So we notice a much crisper look, but we can still see a lot of little indications of the pixels. We can close that out, and then we also have our bicubic setting. We can go ahead and render that. And now we can take a look and see that overall this looks pretty good. We do have a bit of crispness in some areas where we can still really see the definition, where it's not completely blurred, but we also don't see, like we were using with normalized, where we have that overall pixel still defined. So really, the best method is whichever one looks the best. And you might have to just switch between them and find out which is going to look the best for specifically what it is you're working on. And this is something you need to pay attention to if you're working with texture maps. And it's definitely extremely important if you're using texture maps for bumps, because if you have the wrong setting set up for a bump map, you're going to really get some undesired results and see those pixels. So these interpolation types are very important. I'm going to switch that back to none. We're just going to zoom out so we can see our terrain again. Just kind of reposition that. And we're going to take a quick look at the tiling, where we have X and Y currently set to repeat. And because of the type of texture that I have applied to this terrain, we're really not going to notice a lot of changes. If I change these to once, we will definitely see that show up. And if we go ahead and render, we can see that our material is only showing up in one block because of our image scale. If I bring this up to 1, we're going to notice a much larger area being influenced. But overall, we're just seeing that one specific tile. If we set that to repeat, then they repeat themselves, and we're able to create sort of a seamless look. Now we can also do this on either one axis or the other, so I could just do once on the X but not on the Y, and now we can see we have a strip where we're repeating on the Y-axis, but on the X-axis we only see that one specific tile. And we also have a mirror mode, and that's going to mirror rather than repeat. So instead of placing our material in the same place over and over, it's going to mirror itself when it reaches that edge. And it's going to be very difficult to tell with this specific texture, so let's load in something that'll be a little bit easier to see. So I'm just going to click on our little arrow, and we can select any of these defaults. I'm just going to select this angelfish bitmap, or actually JPEG, and we can take a look, and now we can see all of these images. I'm going to change this tiling back to repeat, and we can see all the fish showing up and our overall texture. We take a look, and we can see it looks the same because it is repeating. Let's go ahead and switch that to mirror. We'll mirror it on the X and the Y. Click OK. And now we can see that our material is being mirrored rather than repeated. So we have our objects blending in, and they're showing up in opposite directions. And this can be very useful for a lot of different settings, where you just have maybe one side of a surface, but you want to mirror that over to the other side. For instance, if you were working on a set of double doors, and you had one door, but you wanted to have the other door look exactly the same, or have a nice seam in between where the handles would be on the inside, and we can use this method to achieve that effect. So let's go back in, and I'm going to change this back to our repeat mode, and I'm also going to load in a different image. We're just going to load in this oak that comes with view and load that in. You can take a look at our scene, and we can see the seam showing up because this isn't a seamless texture. So we can see those seams showing up in certain areas. If I was to change this to our mirror mode, then those seams will basically disappear. But that's mainly because we have very dark areas on the edges, and sometimes it's really not going to fix that. And it can give you sort of an interesting look around those edges if they are being mirrored, because it will look like they're being mirrored. So I'm going to bring that back to repeat. But let's take a look at some of our other options available with our mapped picture. If we take a look within our picture file settings, you can see we have a color blend. This is really nice for overwriting and blending together to achieve a different overall color without using our color correction. So we can select color blend, and now we can blend the overall color of our image together with a specific color that we can select. So we can right mouse click, and we can either reset the color if we've already have one loaded in. We can copy a color from another location. So if I wanted this color, I could right mouse click, copy, and then right mouse click and paste that color. Or I can just right mouse click and select edit color. And then we have our color selection, which will allow us to pick another color that we'd like to blend this together with. So let's select something more of a blue and click OK. And now if we drag our slider, which is currently set to 0%, and we raise that to a higher value, we start to blend that blue along with the existing color. If we take a look at our preview render, we can see that a little bit better. And basically right now what it's actually doing is just using more of a multiply mode. So if we're used to image processes and programs like Photoshop, where you have multiply modes and overlay modes and things like that, and even View has a couple of settings within the function editor that are similar. Our basic mode is just going to blend the colors together, where we're still going to see a lot of the definition of our image map, but with just that overlaid color. Even though it doesn't look entirely blue, That's because we're still blending together these two specific colors, and we're going to get the combination. So if we edit this color again, and we'll bring this to something more, let's do an orange, and click OK. Now we can see a lot more of that orange color showing up, and depending on how bright our color is, that will also affect. So we can go to Edit Color, and if we make this a much darker color, we're going to see that it becomes darker when we're blending them. Edit our color. If we make a very bright, let's do a brighter green, and click OK, we can now see that showing up. We can also use this color as a direct overlay by selecting our Color Mask option. What this will do is basically just put this color directly over our texture, and then we just adjust the overall opacity of that color. So if we have it at 100%, we're going to fully see the blend with color setting, whatever we have set for our color, and we will not see our image map at all anymore because we have a mask. And this mask is completely covering our overall texture. With lower values, we're just seeing a lighter amount. But if you notice, once we start to get to those higher values, we're going to see a lot of the definition of the actual texture start to be removed. And that's because our color is starting to dominate those overall effects. If we have the color mask turned off, then we're blending the two together, and we don't lose our definition or any of our details from our actual image map. And we can just take a look at that in our preview, and we can see we have that light bit of green showing up, but overall we still see the definition of our wood grain. And if we turn on Color Mask and we take a look at the render, we just see that overall color. I'm just going to turn these off, and if we take a look at our last option, we have color correction. Now this is available for both our mapped pictures and procedural colors, and this gives us the ability to overwrite our overall color and sort of change what our material is going to look like. So right now we just have our basic sort of orangish wood color, and our overall color is actually being calculated because of this image. And every material you use will calculate its overall color. And keep in mind that position and rotation of specific materials will affect the overall color. If I right mouse click and go to Edit Color, we can take a look at the specific values. We have red, green, and blue, and we can see we have 172, 109, and 108. I'm going to click OK. If we go down to reposition our material or our texture, I can rotate this just by clicking on one of our arrows, depending on which direction we want to go to. But what that can do is change our overall color. So if we go to Edit Color, and for this specific option in this map, we're really not going to see too much of a change, basically because the overall image really is about the same color, but sometimes when you have images where it might be very dark on one side compared to another, it could recalculate that overall color a little bit differently. And let's just load in another image really quick, something with a lot more variation of color. And we'll select our Earth map and click OK. And even with this image, basically if we adjust this, we still don't really see that color change, which is a very good thing. And that means it's calculating correctly. But just note that sometimes rotating your image will change the overall color. But let's take a look, go back, and load in that oak. And we can adjust our overall color. So let's right mouse click, go to Edit Color, and now we can see that the setting that it has calculated based on our image map, and let's select something else. We're going to move this over to the blue and click OK. And now we can see our preview has refreshed, and if we take a look at our actual terrain and the render, we can see that it's blue, and it's no longer our overall color that was originally calculated. So this way we can adjust the color of our terrain still using our options that we have for our texture map without using the color blend. And like I said, this option is also available when we're working with procedural colors. Now, one of the nice things about this feature is we can still see our orange in here. And that means that it's saved, and when we reset our color, right mouse click, select reset, that original color that was saved will now come back, and we don't have to worry about losing what we had. Click OK, and close out the material editor, and now we can see we're back to that original color. So we never have to worry about actually losing our default color that is created for our surface, since it is always saved. Click Edit Color again, we'll make this more of a red, and we can still see that option in there. Edit Color, we can change that to something blue, and we can still see that original color within our color correction. So click Reset, now we're back to that calculated color based on our image. That's something that's just really nice to have. So let's take a look now at our procedural colors and how those are created. We're going to change our color mapping mode, color mode, from map picture to procedural colors. We can see that we have our overall color still in here, and this is being calculated based on our color map. And with our procedural mode, we can see we have a couple of different things to change our settings with. We have our overall preview of what our color production is going to look like. We also have a filter to edit anything part of this color production, which is actually going to be node-based, and when we get into the function editor, you'll be able to see that. To the right of that is our color map, and what's actually creating the color for this specific object and material. And underneath that, we have our function scale, where we can adjust the overall size on all of our different axes. So we can stretch it out if we need to, or we can scale it down proportionately or scale it up, depending on what it is that we want. And also something that is independent from our scale of our actual material itself. Now, we currently have a gradient that is controlling our overall color. And if we take a look at the render, we really can't see that gradient at all. And all we're really seeing is just basically the middle color that is produced by this gradient. And that's because we don't have any functions or any nodes controlling how our gradient interacts with our material. So first, let's just take a look at loading in different color maps and editing them. We can right mouse click and we can load a color map. We could also double click to pick our chooser, and that way we can also load in a color map, and that works the same way. You can see that. We can right mouse click, we can also save anything we've created custom. We can also copy and paste from other locations. We can reset our color map. If I reset that, it brings us back to a black. And then we can also click Edit Color Map, which will allow us to create a specific gradient or even just one solid color to create the color for our object. So we select our last point. We can see our current color is black. We can right mouse click, go to Edit Color, and now we can select a specific color. And we can use brown, click OK, and if we take a look, we can see that brown surface showing up. And like I was saying, because we don't have any real functions controlling our color, it's going to look solid, so even if I change this to a gradient, we're still going to see only one solid color. Now, to create other parts and actually create a gradient, what we're going to do is just click, and we're going to hold down the mouse, the left mouse button, and we can drag, and we can see that little slider on the bottom, and also our position is being changed. And this allows us to select where we'd like to put our new key point or new key color. So we're going to select New Key Color, and it's going to bring up our color selection. We can change this to something more of a green and click OK. And now we have a nice gradient between our green and our brown color. We can also adjust these settings and pull this out a little bit further, and now we can see more of this green material and then a quicker fade to that brown. I'm going to pull this out all the way and just click OK. And if we let this just render we see one solid color again, mostly in the center of our material. We're going to go back to our color map and click Edit. We can see that we have an upper clamping mode and a lower clamping mode. And this is very similar to the way our repeat and mirror functions worked before with our image maps. And what we have is the ability to clamp. In other words, what will happen is once we reach the end of our gradient, our color will continue. We also have a mirror mode. So instead of this color continuing, we start to backtrack through our gradient. And we can mirror our entire gradient once we reach that full extent. And we also have a repeat mode, which will start from one end to the other. So if we expand beyond the color of our gradient, we're going to start to see green right next to our brown if we're using the repeat mode. We're going to stick with clamp right now, which is just going to expand upon our first and last key colors if we go beyond our gradient. But like I said, right now we really don't have anything controlling this color, so let's take a look and actually create a function to modify this gradient and how it reacts to our material. So we're going to right mouse click on our preview and we're going to click Edit Function. And now we can see the function editor and everything that is creating our current material. All of our links, and we have our input nodes on the top, which control a variety of different settings. Our position, our normal, altitude, slope, orientation, and time. And then on the bottom, we have our output nodes, which are color, alpha, bump, highlight, transparency, and reflection. We can also add other output nodes and input nodes to these function, and there's a couple of different ways of doing that. And we'll take a look at those a little bit later. One thing I'm going to note is that we can still see our projected texture map from before. Since we changed it from a mapped picture to a procedural, this node is still left in our function editor. And whether or not you want to keep that or not is entirely up to you. I'm just going to select this node and hit delete. And that will remove it from our function. Even though it wasn't actually connected to anything, it wasn't really hurting, but it can still take up some space, and we really don't need it there, so it's not that important. We can see that by default, we have this small string of connections for our current node and our current color map. Our gradient is connected to a color node. If we take a look on the left, we can see how we can add a color node. So if we click into anywhere in our function off of any of our selected attributes, we can see sort of an invisible box, just a red box that is going to determine where our next node we want to add is going to be created. So we could create a new color node if we wanted to, just by selecting our color node, and now we can see that show up. Now our color nodes have a couple of different options, and we can take a look and we can see we have just a basic color map. We have a 2-color output, a linear interpolation 2, spline, 3-color output, and we also have color correction options. So we can use a variety of these different color nodes to affect how the color is achieved and passed through our output node to our color. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that node we just created, and we're going to take a look at this specific node. And before we do anything else, there's a couple of function settings I just want to show you. If we go all the way to the upper right, we can see a little camera. If we click on that, this is our function output observer, which allows us to preview our material without having to close out the function editor. So this way, while we're working the entire time on our function, we can see a preview of it. Now within this preview, we can adjust the scale. Right now, because we don't really have any overall definitions, changing the scale isn't going to matter. But this scale is directly related to the preview and not to the actual material. So this allows us to see what it would look like if it was smaller, but not actually changing the material. We also have an origin located underneath, which allows us to adjust where the original position and pivot is for our material. So if we want to move surface over to the right and preview that, We can adjust maybe the X or the Y, and we can just change these values to move the surface within our preview. And keep in mind, these are just for our preview and nothing else. And I'm going to close this for right now, and we're going to take a look. We can see in one of our other sets, we have the ability to zoom in and out. If we right mouse click, we can move around our view of our function editor. We can zoom out using the negative, so we can use either the plus or minus to zoom in and out. We also have the ability to select and frame our selection, so we can click that option, and now if we draw out a box and let go, it will zoom us in directly to what we have selected. To the left of that is frame all. You can click on that, and now our entire function will be set in view. So if you ever end up where you're off your function and you can't see anything, you can just click frame, and that will show you and bring everything back into view. To the left of our zooming functions, we have an undo and a redo option. And to the left of that, we have our, if we go ahead and select one of our nodes, we can see we have cut, copy, and paste. And those are all pretty basic commands. One thing to keep in mind is if you do want to undo a setting, it's best just to use these options rather than keyboard shortcuts unless you have specific keyboard shortcuts set up for the function editor's undo and redo options. All the way to the left, we can see we have a couple of more options. This button that we have highlighted right now, if I go ahead and turn that off, we're not going to see some of the connections right now because of the filters and the maps we have loaded. So I'm going to turn that on, and we're going to wait until we bring in a specific node where we'll actually be able to see this. But if we take a look to the left, we have our options, and basically our graph options, because our function editor is a graph, and the way we connect our nodes is all part of that graph. So go back into our options. We can see we have a show all previews and graph. What this will do is show all of our different nodes as specific images and a render of what it's going to look like. If we take a look at our filter, we can see that show and graph under our filter node is currently turned off. If we go into our color map node, we can see show and graph is clicked on. So if we turn on show and graph for our filter, we can see the effects of our filter. Now, this is just a basic filter, so we're not going to see any options, and we'll see that a little bit better later. But we can turn these on and off at any time to compress and sort of save some space if we're working with very large functions. Now we can either select to show all our previews, and that way anything that can be previewed will be previewed, and automatically show and graph for all nodes will be turned on. If we have preview only noises and colors, then all of our filters and our math nodes will all be compressed, but we'll see our color maps and any of our fractal or noise nodes. If we go back into that, we can also see we have the option to hide all previews, and that way everything will be compressed and nothing will show up in the graph. And then we also have show arrows on links, and that's basically these little arrows that we see on the bottom connecting our links. And then we can also show links as straight lines. So you can either turn that option on or off depending on what you're working with and how many different nodes you're working with. If we go into the preview options, we have the ability to adjust our actual previews of our nodes. And currently right now this is set to sphere. Well, I could change this to cube, and that way we're previewing a cube. We could do cylinder, a cone, a marble, which is just a smaller sphere. And then we can also do an XY plane, which is going to fill the entire surface, and a 2D plane, which will also fill the entire surface, but the sizes are a little bit different than the XY plane. And we'll see that better with different functions that actually have definition rather than this color map, which is just one solid color. So we'll change that back to the sphere. If we go down to background type, we can set this to a uniform, which is just going to show our background color gradient that we have set, and we can change that and load in a color map, create your own, just as we would with the actual color map we're using to create our color. And all of our color maps can be copied and pasted throughout the entire program, so it's all compatible. If we go back to that checker mode, we can see that we have our checkers showing up with the color of our gradient and our background color. Where on the left we have blue, where our checkers are showing up as blue, and on the right is a white color, and we can see the other checkers, the in-between ones, are showing up as white. We can also choose whether or not we'd like to use the local light, and we can see the effects of that show up in our scene. So it really depends on what it is you want your preview options to be. And sometimes if you're working on a specific shape of a material or an object, then you're going to want to change the different previews available. I'm going to keep these settings, close this out, and we're going to go back into our function. I'm going to frame this so we can see the entire view.